What I remember discovering going to a doctor when I came back, my blood result had higher cholesterol. And then when I ran the ratios of like HDL to triglyceride and looked at those, I was completely healthy. But just on the numbers of hypercholesterolemia, and I don't remember whether they had differentiated between low density and high density and all that stuff. But I'm curious because the message, I'm a child from the 80s and 90s. In the 80s and 90s, fat was vilified, like completely. Fat is bad, and fat causes high cholesterol. So we're going to remove fat from everything, and everything's going to say fat-free. I remember, and I think it still does, but licorice had a thing that said fat-free. Well, licorice didn't have fat in it anyways, but because it was part of the marketing.
Cholesterol free.
So they just, right, and then they just put sugar in everything for flavor, and of course, sugar is not great. So curious if you could talk to, because I think a lot of us I still have that programming that I have to consciously be like, this ribeye is good for me, and so I'm curious if you could speak to how fat actually affects the body versus sugar and the effects on cholesterol and inflammatory markers.
Great question, Mark. Yeah, and that's one of the most popular questions I get on my YouTube channel as comments like, my cholesterol went up, or my doctor wants to put me on a statin. There's so many moving parts to cholesterol. I would say this first and foremost: total cholesterol on your lab report is almost meaningless. It doesn't really show the full picture. As a matter of fact, more people die from heart disease with low cholesterol, normal to low cholesterol, than with high cholesterol. It's more dangerous to have low cholesterol than to have high cholesterol.
It's so against the narrative of pharma.
So against it, right? Statins is a multi-billion-dollar industry, right? Of course, they don't want to get that out there. But if you think about cholesterol, what is cholesterol even needed for? To build your sex hormones. When I mentioned that membrane, that's so important, it's the intelligence of your cells. Part of it's made up of cholesterol. If cholesterol is so bad, why are we made up of cholesterol? The body
right.
loves cholesterol, and God didn't make any mistakes with us. So it's a lot of moving parts. So yeah, like you said, like what Mark did, you look at your HDL, which is your high density lipoprotein. It's very protective. You look at your LDL, but also not just total LDL, because people just say, oh, LDL is bad cholesterol. But no, you look at the particle sizes of your LDL, because there's two different particle sizes. So you look at the small particles and the large particles. If you have too much small particles, that's bad. But if you have a lot of large and not a lot of small, that's good. So the particle sizes. And then you look at triglycerides, and then you do what you did. You get your HDL to triglyceride ratio. You look at those markers, and then you look at your inflammatory markers, and that gets you a full picture. And it's not fat that's going to cause an issue with these numbers. It's maybe the seed oils, the bad fats that we mentioned, but it's primarily sugar. If you think about cholesterol, and here's the reason why it's still vilified to this day, not as much as the 80s and 90s. I'm also an 80s and 90s kid, but even to this day, we're dealing with that problem. And that's because in the 1950s, a gentleman named Ansel Keys, he faked some research to show that cholesterol was the cause of heart disease. And the reason he came to that conclusion was because when they did autopsies on people who had heart attacks, they saw an excess buildup of cholesterol, and they made a decision that the cholesterol caused the heart attacks. But that's not true. The cholesterol was actually there to repair the damage that was happening for other reasons. So the analogy is this: if there was a house that kept getting on fire in my neighborhood, and every time I drove by that house that's on fire, and every time I drive by, I see that there's firefighters at the scene of the crime, I blame the firefighters for the fire. That would not make sense. It's the same thing with cholesterol. It's a Band-Aid to repair the damage. Inflammation is the root cause of heart disease. So the question is, what is causing the inflammation? And that is the seed oils, the sugar, eating excessively, not getting enough sleep, not working on the mindset. So that's the direction we want to focus on. It's not the fat that's causing it.
So if we have abnormal lab results in terms of things like insulin, and I should qualify that if this is not replacing medical advice, so please go see a doctor. And okay, so if we have abnormal lab results in terms of higher cholesterol, A1C off, like our insulin, is a good at least movement towards rectifying that or getting the ratios in the right way? Is it to move to ketosis first? Like you were saying, if people who are metabolically what is it, damaged? Is that the right word?
Metabolically challenged, I would say.
Yeah. So in order for them to restore and repair and get their body back to metabolic flexibility, is the fastest way to do that, or one of the most efficient, just so the body can rest? Is it to go into a ketogenic
Yes,
space?
it is, because if you think about when you are in ketosis, you're dramatically lowering insulin, lowering glucose, and that's exactly what they need, because the three macronutrients, protein, carbs, and fat, carbs will spike glucose and insulin more than any other macronutrient. Of course, depends on the carbs versus processed versus whole food carbs, but still, it'll spike glucose and insulin more. Protein is second, but it's barely a big spike. And then fat doesn't even touch the dial on glucose and insulin. So therefore,
Wow.
when you increase healthy fat and protein and lower carbs, aka ketosis, you are reducing the damage of constantly high levels of insulin and glucose that has caused the metabolic challenges.
And I know when I used to work in oncology, they recommended for some patients, depending on the variables, to go on a ketogenic diet because it reduced angiogenesis, like the proliferation of like growing more vasculature in a tumor. So they recommend going on ketogenic diet. So then if we're going to go on that and we're going to go into this state of ketosis, then you said do it for 3 months and then start to go into flexibility. So buy your book and the Keto Flex. And what about the use of things like, I know that company Levels that has the monitors that you put on your arm. Do you, because I know like for checking that you're in ketosis, they have those little pee strips, right? And then I think you can also do the thing, does it poke your finger?
Yep.
And then you can do levels. So can you walk us through maybe what are the best ways to do that?
Yeah, absolutely. So Levels is fantastic. I also like NutriSense. They both do a good job. They're called continuous glucose monitors, and I love that. It's one of the best, if you want to call it, biohacking tools that you can use. A CGM would be amazing. And there was a lot of barriers for years on getting a CGM. You would have to be diabetic, and then your doctor would write the prescription, which is insane, Mark, because they wait for you to get a diagnosis to be able to give you something to monitor your diagnosis versus being preventative.
Right.
Wouldn't that be great if we could just prevent that diagnosis? So, what Levels has done, and NutriSense and some other companies, is they remove the barrier. So they write the prescription for you. They have a dietitian that works with you. At least NutriSense does. And a CGM, like you said, it goes on your arm and it gives you 24/7 snapshot of your glucose. It does not give you ketones. The company that makes a continuous ketone monitor, they're going to crush, but there's not that yet. But it gives you glucose, and I love that. For ketones, if you're going to test that, there's three ways to test. You mentioned a couple of them. There's urine strips, which is measuring one of the ketone bodies called acetoacetate. There's blood finger prick looking at beta hydroxybutyrate. And then there's breath meters looking at acetone. Those are the three ketone bodies. I don't like the urine strips because they are not accurate. So I wouldn't recommend those, although they're affordable. I'm sorry, but they're not accurate. Breath meters kind of hit or miss, but there is a good one on the market called Biosense. I like them. But I'm going to focus on the finger prick, which is looking at BHB, beta hydroxybutyrate. That's probably the best way to check ketones. And the one that I use is from Keto Mojo. So you could get a CGM and a Keto Mojo, and then you'll get both readings. And that would be the best way to see. And if you're 0.5 or higher on your Keto Mojo, you're in ketosis, and that would be the goal.
And for something like a continuous glucose monitor like Levels, you're looking to see what the impact on your glucose after exercise, after eating, after everything.
Yeah, everything. It's so cool because, and stress, mental stress, relationship stress.
Ooh, I'd love to see
Oh my
that.
gosh, right? Or a podcast. I wore mine. I've worn one for like 7-8 months already, and I would test before a podcast interview like this, and let's say it's like 86, which is good. And then I would go into this podcast, get so excited, and it would be like 97, 98. And it's like interesting to see what like excitement does. And then I would exercise and do it. So it's just interesting. But yeah, it would give you all of those readings. It'll also give you clues if you have a sensitivity to a specific food that might be healthy for Ben, but not healthy for Mark. And you see a big glucose spike from, I don't know, broccoli or Brussels sprouts or blueberry, something that you might not think, but you might have some sort of sensitivity to it. So there's so many benefits to a CGM. I love it. I use it a lot with my students.